Thank you so much, Paul. And thank you so much, Maria, for inviting me to be part of the current legal problem series of this year. It's always an honor to be at this podium. So for those you know me, I'm working in the area of investor stewardship for about 10 years now. And quite often, I'm asking myself, why do I care? Why does investor stewardship matter? And of course, I suppose, there are the obvious reasons. The UK asset management industry alone manages around 11 trillion pounds of assets. If you look at public equity, it's quite clear that institutional investors are one of the most dominant holders. So according to data, they have about 62% of market capitalization in the UK. But what I want to emphasize is that the attention is not just because of the significant growth of the industry. It's actually sits somewhere else. And I'm going to borrow the phrase from John Kay's book in 2015. We do care about stewardship because institutional investors manage others people's money. That's, for me, is the starting point about why we care about stewardship and why investor stewardship matters. Now, what is also interesting is that if you look at the literature and if you go and read scholarship or articles on investor stewardship, and even if you look at policymaking, you see that the opinions are quite divided. It is quite a debated sphere, and there is a diversity of opinions about what a good steward is, what a good monitor is. There are different visions about passivity or activism, active engagement, and this debate is quite perplexing. And I think that if you think about what is happening in the UK over the last 12 months or so, if you think about the listing rules, the proposed listing rules, or even yesterday, the pension plan changes that were announced by Jeremy Hunt, you will realize that we are talking about something that it does matter. Now, the next point I want to raise is that even though it does matter, it's not really quite clear what we mean by it. It's not really clear what we mean when we use the term investor stewardship. Take, for instance, stewardship codes around the world. Actually, I spent 3 years of my life, and Paul was also contributed to that, into a book, the Global Shareholder Stewardship book, where we try to understand how stewardship codes were developed around the world. And there is not a single meaning of what stewardship means. Some codes mean, or some codes think that stewardship is about engagement, shareholder engagement and monitoring. Others take an ESG perspective. Also, others, like the UK code, the 2020 version, takes a more holistic perspective. It's about allocation, investment capital, and management of that capital. So it's not just about shareholder stewardship, as the title of our book. Policy, practitioners themselves also have different perspectives. If you look at the reportings, I'm currently finished about 9 months or even more of my life reading all the stewardship reports to the new code. You will see that the meanings are different there too. They're using phrases like active ownership or responsibility, responsible investment, ESG, monitoring, engagement. So there are different perceptions, different perspectives of what investor stewardship means. I think what all this tells us is that there is a need, actually there is a pressing need for a kind of an analytical framework of stewardship. I wouldn't say a theory of stewardship. I think that would have been too grandiose for this lecture, but maybe an analytical framework of what we mean by stewardship. And this is actually the gap that this paper will try to fill. So I think the starting point is to trace the origins of the term. Even though in corporate governance, the term appears about 2 decades ago, or even 25 years ago, the term stewardship as such has very long roots, and it goes back to the medieval ages and the Anglo-Saxon word stig and word, which means housekeeper or house guardian. Now, it's also interesting if you look at different types of literature, so outside of company law, outside of corporate governance, you will see different perceptions. So, for instance, in accounting, they're using stewardship, focusing on the stewardship of managers. And they are placing stewardship within the principal agent framework. Then in management literature, I'm sure most of you may be familiar with the stewardship theory of management, where they see a steward, again focusing on managers, but they see a steward as quite different from an agent. So a steward, unlike an agent, is not self-interested, is not individualistic. It's about serving the other. So it has a more pro-organizational conception, if this makes sense. And then you have also literatures from ethics or leadership or even ecology, where they are talking about a kind of an ethical stewardship. And this goes back to the way that, to the man as the steward of the god, like, Christian theology back of the medieval era. And they're talking about trust and virtue. Now, corporate governance is much more narrow, I would say. So the perception in corporate governance, the perception of stewardship, it was, they were always using the term to describe the managers. So stewardship theory in corporate governance was opposed to the agency theory and the stakeholder model. But it was mainly about the managers as stewards. And again, the idea was that a manager acting as steward is the kind of a trustee. It's like the heroic manager of the 1970s in the US, or the manager that Dodd back in 1931 was talking about. So the kind of a trustee for the society. Of course, from a legal point of view, managers are neither agents nor stewards. And also from our perspective, shareholders have never really been seen as stewards in corporate governance literature. Shareholders were mainly seen as principals within the agency theory, with the exception of family shareholders. So if you think about minority shareholders in corporate governance literature, the traditional narrative is that shareholders are the principals who monitor the managers who are the agents. And this was the starting point, the traditional principal agent narrative that has influenced both corporate law, but also corporate governance. Now, of course, there has been a lot of criticism on the agency theory, which I'm not going to talk about that today, but I want to raise your attention to a single thing. Institutional investors are intermediaries. And actually, they are more agents rather than principals, if this makes sense. They are agents of their clients and the beneficiaries. And by being agents, by acting as agents, they may or may not act as principals of the managers, depending on whether they take a passive or an active position. So they are mostly agents rather than principals, and that's the distinguishing feature of institutional investors compared to other minority shareholders, like individuals, for instance, who are not agents for somebody else. Now, again, this is not my discovery, right? This is already there in the literature. And Gilson and Gordon, for instance, they are talking quite famously about the double set of agency relationships. So this idea that when you are thinking about institutional investors are not just the principals. They're not just the monitors of the managers, but at the same time, these are the agents of their own clients and beneficiaries, right? Now, and actually this is the dominant view in corporate governance in the UK and in the US. I'm not going to touch upon how this is viewed in other jurisdictions, like in Japan, for instance. I'm focusing in the UK and the US. Now, one of the problems of this theory is that it focuses a lot on the powers rather than on the responsibilities. So it's more about the power dynamics, and it doesn't really ask, all right, let's say investors are indeed agents and indeed they're principals. So when they are acting, to whom they're accountable and for what? So that's not an answer that this theory is giving to us. And that's why, in my view, it is quite an insufficient theory. It's quite an insufficient theory to address current problems. And this is the gap that I'm trying to fill by developing a kind of three-dimensional framework of stewardship, of investor stewardship. So I introduced stewardship as exercise of power on behalf of others and for others. And I'm going very briefly to explain to you what I mean by those three elements using the example of shareholder stewardship. Again, shareholder stewardship, for those who are not familiar with stewardship, is the term we are using when the asset is public equity. So when institutional investors invest in public equity, so they are acting as shareholders. So that's what I mean by shareholder stewardship. And actually, for instance, 10 years ago, this was the only stewardship we knew. There was no other type of stewardship. But today, I think the term investor stewardship is a more proper one because there are other types of stewardships, like, for instance, debt holder stewardship, infrastructure stewardship, etc. So I will try to take that example and apply each of those elements. So what do we mean by power? What do we mean when we say institutional investors exercise power? This goes back to the basics of company law. And this is about the division of power between shareholders and company directors. So in other words, that's the corporate side of things, and it relies a lot on company law, because the more rights you have on company law, the more likely to use those rights. And I'm not going to spend too much time on that aspect, because I think that's probably the easiest to grasp. And of course, just to say that I think that over the last 10 years or so, the fact that we have the rise in firm-specific activism, the fact that we have emerging constellations of like-minded investors using informal engagement together with the support of third-party actors like an investor forum or the PRI, all these support the fact that investors have power and they are using it. So I think at this stage, we should, I suppose we all agree that the kind of, the shareholder passivity of the past is a kind of fallacy. It doesn't really apply anymore, this view that investors are passive. They are not passive anymore, and they're using their power in different ways, both firm-specific and also at the portfolio level. So the key takeaway is that a steward exercises power. So that's essential, but it's not the only, it's not a sufficient element. So a steward exercises power on behalf of others. And this, of course, goes to intermediation. As I said before, an institutional investor exercises power on behalf of clients, on behalf of beneficiaries, if you have a pension trustee, for instance. And this is the investment side of stewardship. And here is where investment management regulation, here is where case law on fiduciary duties, on trustees' obligations, and other types of duties are becoming quite relevant. So if we stop here, right, you may ask yourselves, okay, yeah, it does make sense. A steward exercises power on behalf of others. But this does not really explain why we need the concept of steward. An agent also exercises power on behalf of others. So what is the distinguishing feature? What is the distinguishing feature between a steward and an aid's end. So I argue that the distinguishing feature is an other serving function, that a steward exercises power on behalf of others, like an agent does, but in doing so, the steward is acting for others. And this goes back to the stewardship theory of management and the idea of psychological or active ownership. So here the idea is that all the rights, all the power are exercised for pro-social aims. And some are using also the term active ownership, but I don't really agree with the term active ownership, because if you use the adjective active, then I think it's quite tricky to bring passive investors who may act as stewards within that, within that framework. And also ownership as a term, in my view, is also quite problematic, because shareholders are not the owners in legal terms. So that's why I suggest that for others element. Now, the problem then becomes, so if we accept that a shareholder steward exercises power on behalf of others and for others, the problem, I think, is that those others here, those that you are acting on behalf, are not always the same as those others. And this is where conflicts of interest emerge. And I'm going to give you, to elaborate that, by showing to you what I call multiple relationships, multiple stewardship relationships. So here, I tried to make it as simplistic as I could. So that's why you will see that I have no service providers, no investment consultants. I only have asset owners and asset managers to try to make it simple. So the idea, so here you have a simple flow of funds, right? So from the left to the right. And this tried to show to you how intermediation works. So very simple, you have individuals. Individuals, let's say, invest in asset owners. So let's say, a pension fund. So in that case, the asset owner is what I call a client steward. So he's a steward who acts on behalf of those individuals, either clients or beneficiaries, depending on the type of the asset owner, and also is acting for their benefit. Now let's take an example where you have delegated stewardship. So an individual invests in an asset owner, but the asset owner does not have any in-house stewardship, and they delegate that to the asset manager. In that case, the client relationship, and I think that is important for law, the client relationship is here. The asset owner is the client. So in that case, the asset manager is the steward who is acting on behalf of the asset owner. There is no direct relationship between the asset manager and the individual. So in that case, those two parties are only connected through what I call end investor stewardship. And this has significant legal implications, as I will show in a minute. Now, I suppose this makes sense from the investment side of things, but we also have the corporate governance side of things. So an asset manager or an asset owner, at the end, they're becoming an asset holder, right? So take a company, for instance. So let's say they buy a stake in a company. In that case, according to the UK code and all the codes around the world, shareholder stewardship is about what the asset manager or the asset owner, who has a direct ownership to the asset, what they are doing, how they perform the role as an asset steward. In our case, as a shareholder steward. At the same time, the stewardship codes try to expand the others, and they are talking about a shareholder steward who invests, who manages to promote the economy, the environment, the society. And this is what I call enlightened stewardship. And as you may notice, there are some dotted lines here because this is not legally mandated. It's not a relationship that is provided by law. by hard law, by binding rules. Now, I think at this stage, we may need to take a step back and ask ourselves, all right, this makes sense, or maybe makes sense, but then what is the purpose? What is the purpose of investor stewardship? And I think to ask that, to provide an answer to that, we need to ask, who are the others? Who are the others on behalf of whom an investor stewardship is acting? And who are the others for whom an investor steward is expecting to act? The starting point here, I think, is the regulatory duties imposed on asset owners and asset managers, either by case law, trust law, investment management regulation. And it's clear from those duties that you are talking about what I call client stewardship. So the others are the clients. The others are the beneficiaries. So those are the ones on behalf of whom an active steward is acting. So hard law overlooks all the other stewardship relationships. So for instance, that I think I gave you that example before, when an asset owner delegates stewardship to an asset manager, the asset manager has only duties to the asset owner, not to the end investors. So end stewardship is not part of hard law. So then the question arises whether those others can extend beyond those protected by contractual and trustship relationships. And this goes back to the basics. This goes back to the Kay review back in 2012 and the proposal that fiduciary duties should extend to end investors. So that we need to find a way to connect the others, to connect the end investors with the stewards. And I think that this goes back to the question I posed before. What is the purpose of management? What is the purpose of investment management? And here, I think we should distinguish between the private aspects and the public aspects, because from a public dimension, it's about client stewardship. It is about the clients and the beneficiaries. But from a public perspective, it is much more than that. The others are much broader. They include the end investors, they include the asset, so the company, the fellow shareholders, the stakeholders, they include also negative externalities, they include the environment, the society, the economy. But again, what I need to emphasize is that all these other types of stewardship are not primarily governed by hard law. So then my next point is that the way I view stewardship codes is as being able to fill this gap, left from regulatory duties. So to fill that gap by solidifying the others beyond the clients and beneficiaries. And I think that here, the UK Stewardship Code, the 2021, shows to us how this can be done. Principles 4 and 7, for instance, they are expanding the notion of others, and they are including consideration of market risks, but also consideration of material, environmental, social, governance and social risks. However, I think the question then is, can an investor serve others when those others are not financial material? So what materialities in the UK Stewardship Code? Because the code, for those who haven't read the code just uses the term material. It doesn't clarify if we're talking about financial materiality, double materiality, intrinsic materiality. So I think the question is, can an investor serve others who are not financial material? And then I suppose the most difficult question is, which others should be prioritized if there are conflicts of interests? To put it otherwise, do you prioritize your clients and beneficiaries? because these are the only ones that are protected by hard law. Or you can also prioritize some others, some others, like the environment, for instance, or the society. So in the paper, which is still much work in progress, so feel free to send me comments after the lecture if you have any. I'm arguing that that Principle 7 of the UK Stewardship Code essentially accommodates what we normally describe as financial materiality, but also double materiality in the sense of beta enhancement. So not just alpha, but also beta. It doesn't accommodate, in my view, intrinsic materiality, so real world impact with no financial gain. But what I also highlight is that the code seems to condition that broadening of others, not only on materiality, but also on the avoidance of conflicts of interests. Because the code several times talks about clients and beneficiaries and the way that stewardship serves clients and beneficiaries. So it looks like that this broadening, however welcoming that broadening is, it is conditioned not only on materiality, but also on the avoidance of conflicts of interest. And some may even say that clients and beneficiaries always come first. The code that does not clarify that, but by not clarifying it, I think, you know, there is a lot of, there is a kind of gap and some uncertainty here. Before I conclude, I don't really know how much time I have left, but before I conclude, okay, so I'm going to finish earlier, I think, which is good because I want to, you know, to listen to questions you may have. But before I conclude, I also want to show you a kind of typology of investor stewardship, because so far I only focused on shareholder stewardship, but shareholder stewardship is only one of the types of stewardship. So in the paper, what I'm trying to do is to analyze the different levels of stewardship. And here I'm using the term micro to describe firm-specific stewardship. So when, you know, what you're doing as a holder of a specific firm or a specific bond, right? So you may be a fixed income steward at the micro level. Then I'm using the term portfolio stewardship to describe the kind of portfolio level stewardship. So you are an index fund, you have a huge portfolio, how you exercise your power as a steward across your portfolio. So it's not about firm-specific stewardship, it's across the portfolio. And some are using the term systematic stewardship or systemic stewardship. In addition to that, I'm proposing that there is also a kind of market level stewardship. And the difference between portfolio and market is that the market is more about beta. It's not about alpha. It's not about improving the alpha of your portfolio. It's about beta. And I think that's also quite an important distinction to make. And of course, there is also the kind of macro level stewardship. And this refers to engagement, not with your asset, but engagement with policymakers, with industry associations, with fellow investors, you know, all the kind of policy advocacy. So that's the macro level. And of course, these complement each other. So it doesn't mean that you are engaging in portfolio stewardship and you can't really engage at the micro level. And actually, most of the times you do everything together, right? So you may engage at the portfolio level, but also for high-profile cases, like for instance, entity number 1 and Exxon a few years ago, you engage with them on the firm-specific level too. In terms of the actors, I think I already mentioned that, but I'm using the term direct stewardship and indirect stewardship to be able to describe the different actors across the investment chain. So here again, if you have an asset owner who delegates stewardship to an asset manager, the asset manager is the direct steward, whereas the asset owner is the indirect steward. And of course, here also should add investment consultants, service providers, even credit rating agencies. So everybody that can influence stewardship and can act as an indirect actor. I think that's quite obvious, the different assets. I mentioned that before, depending on the asset, we may have shareholder stewardship, debt holder stewardship, infrastructure stewardship, even sovereign stewardship, which is becoming quite popular these days. And then in terms of the means, in the past, we were only talking about engagement, either formal or informal, like dialogue. But today, we are thinking about stewardship in a more holistic way. So it's not just about engagement. It starts from the beginning. It's about integration. It's about investment decision-making. And it's also about divestment. So especially in fixed income, for instance, divestment can be a key stewardship tool. And finally, in terms of the themes, again, nothing really innovative here, other than an emphasis that it looks like, even though the kind of traditional stewardship, the value-driven traditional shareholder engagement is still here, what we are saying is a kind of emphasis on a kind of values-focused stewardship rather than single value-focused stewardship. And you may even say, or you may even think that in some cases, that kind of ESG values-focused stewardship, even absorbing the traditional firm-specific engagement. And we see that investors today have less appetite for firm-specific engagement compared to the kind of portfolio market-level stewardship for different reasons, of course. So to conclude, hopefully before earlier than expected, I suppose what I'm trying to do with this paper, which also draws on the book I'm writing, is to present a kind of an anatomy, an analytical framework for investor stewardship, a kind of an easy framework that can be used for the emerging multi-level, multi-actor, multi-asset, multi-mean, and multi-themed investor stewardship. So this was the idea. And by developing this framework, by developing the varieties, what I realized is that the varieties bring forth challenges. The most important challenge, or at least the first challenge, is that the others on whose behalf an investor steward acts are not always the same as the others for who an investor steward is expected to act. I think that's the most important challenge here. And this is, I think, for instance, the example of ESG stewardship or enlightened stewardship can show that. Now, the next important challenge, the next significant challenge is that, which I think is quite overlooked, is that all stewardship relationships, with the exception of client stewardship, do not fall under the primary domain of hard law. You only have soft law stewardship codes to deal with all the others relationships. And actually, if you look at all the codes around the world, so if you forget about the UK and we look at the other codes, you will find out that the other codes do not even think about some of those stewardship relationships. For instance, end investor stewardship is not there, enlightened stewardship is absent in many codes. They mainly focus on what I call asset stewardship, so what you're doing with your asset, mainly as a shareholder steward. I think that this creates a kind of a risk. And the big risk is that if policymakers and investors do not solidify who the others are, do not be explicit about the others and the purpose of stewardship, then the risk is that the investor steward is likely to choose the others for whom is acting. So you are giving a kind of a free pass to choose your others for whom you're acting. And if this happens, then I think that the investor steward is going to return to an agent of clients and beneficiaries alone, forgetting about all the others. Thank you so much.
Dionysia, that was absolutely marvelous. A lot to think about. I wonder if it would be helpful to go back to your flow diagram.
Yes, of course. Sorry. Too many animations. Yeah, here you are.
Okay, good. Now, I noticed a number of old lags in the audience. I imagine there'll be lots of questions forthcoming, but let me kick off with one, which is this. I understand client stewardship. I understand end investor stewardship. I understand enlightened stewardship, because they're all referring to people, though it's a bit unclear who they are in number 4. But what is asset stewardship?
Yeah.
This I find very tricky, because an asset as an inanimate object obviously has no interest. So if you're the medieval field being looked after by a steward while the Lord is fighting the Crusades or advising the king down in London, it doesn't matter to the field whether it's put to arable purposes or used to graze sheep or allowed to return to the wild. So whose interests are we thinking about when we focus on asset stewardship?
Thank you, Paul. And actually, I had one of the biggest challenges was to choose terms to describe each of those relationships. So if you have any ideas about other terms that you think may fit better, just let me know. So the asset stewardship goes back to the basics of company law. So in the case that you gave about the field, is the field itself. In the case of shareholder stewardship, is the company. And then, of course, you're opening the question of what are the interests of the company?
Yeah, I think a company is a field, actually.
So then, you go to company law and you're asking, are you talking about the shareholders?
Yeah.
Are you talking about all the shareholders, the future shareholders, the stakeholders? Who are the others? But that was the idea here, because, and this is, the idea came from the origins of the UK code itself. Because if you think about the 2010 code or the 2012 code, the aim was very simple. The aim was to transform passive investors to activist investors. It was very simple. It wasn't about environment, ESG. It was a very basic idea about how you're transforming the absentee owners to engaged monitors. So this is the idea about asset stewardship. But again, if you think that the asset may not be the proper term, and if you can think of anything else, I would welcome, any other terms. In the paper at later stages, I'm using, I clarify the asset, and I'm talking about shareholder stewardship, debt holder stewardship, infrastructure stewardship, but it was tricky to find a single term that could encompass all these different assets. I suppose you can say investor stewardship, but then I suppose you go back to the first question about what is investor stewardship.
Can I follow up on
Yes, for the online.
Thank you very much. Can I just follow up on that point, but to try and sort of clarify that notion of asset stewardship? If you take the example of a company, a shareholder owes no obligations to pursue the interests of the company. The obligation is the other way around. And so the shareholder can actually pursue its own self-interest in the way it manages the shareholding in the company. But I do wonder whether asset stewardship is really, if you like, a subset of, what are we calling it, client stewardship, in a sense, because the obligation such as there is in relation to an asset holder and an asset is only there by virtue of the client relationship that the asset manager has. It would have no intrinsic stewardship obligation. So I wonder whether it's a sort of a downstream stewardship where the client is an upstream one.
That's, do you want to, is this a follow-up?
Yeah.
Yes, so maybe we'll take both questions together.
You need someone quicker on their feet.
Thank you. So I think I largely agree with that, although I'd put a slightly different sort of cast on it. So I think that there is, it is to an extent a subset of the client stewardship piece, but I also think that there's a slightly different angle to it in the sense that you're aiming at slightly different things with a client stewardship sort of effort and an asset stewardship effort. I think with a client stewardship effort, you've been given essentially a pot of money by a client and you're aiming to sort of meet their financial needs at the end of the day. And you have a level of autonomy as an asset manager as to sort of what you then do with that money. And I think your choice is then sort of, I'm going to invest in this company or this company. So at the client level, your overarching aim is to sort of, put it bluntly, make them money.
Yeah.
But then your choice within the sort of, I suppose, the investment gives you a level of autonomy, and you can effectively then say, well, I'm going to invest in that company, and I can invest in that company, and I can sort of essentially steer what's happening within that company because I've chosen that company for a particular purpose to achieve an aim. And I think there is a slight distinction then between the sort of overarching client stewardship piece and the asset stewardship piece, as far as I see.
Yeah, and that's true. Follow up. My intention here was all, and I think I probably mentioned that I agree that as a shareholder, you have no duties. I mean, under UK law, institutional investors have no duties, unlike controlling shareholders and unlike the situation, for instance, in the US. So this should be the starting point. Exercising your voting rights is a right, is not a duty, right? But then, and that's why I said that only the client stewardship is driven by hard law. Because then, under hard law, you have no duties, and you have a stewardship code that imposes soft law duties. They are not hard, they are soft law, but they are still responsibilities. So this is what this asset stewardship tries to include, this relationship between the asset manager and the asset, which is mainly driven by stewardship codes themselves. Because if you think about company law, that's not part of company law at all. And this is why in the paper I'm talking about the gap filling role of stewardship codes. And this is one of the gaps, trying to fill this relationship. But again, as I said, if you have any other thoughts about the terms, I mean, 3 years ago, we used to use the term shareholder stewardship. So I was using the term shareholder stewardship a lot. The title of my book is Shareholder Stewardship. And we were using the term to describe this relationship here. I mean, both 3 and 1. So both the asset ownership and the client stewardship. But I think now, with the way that we're moving away from shareholder stewardship as the only way of stewardship, I think we need to be quite imaginative and try to think of another term. So again, as I said, you're more than welcome to send me ideas after, but not, I would say, not too long, because then Maria is going to chase me for the paper. So I would need to have the term.
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up on this point that you mentioned, Dionysia, and someone else mentioned about shareholders not having obligations. So exactly right. If I'm an individual who owns shares in company X, there's no legal obligation on me to vote in a particular way or to vote at all. But when you're focusing on institutional investors, there's a subtlety here, because under trust law, if a trustee as a power, then they have a duty to consider whether to exercise that power. So you do start to sort of slip into some
But
legal
this,
rules territory.
I completely agree. And that's why that exactly what I'm trying to do by introducing all these different layers. Because what you just described, I think it goes under the client stewardship.
Yes. Yep.
It doesn't go under the asset stewardship. Under the asset stewardship, under hard law, you have no obligations, because in the UK, under UK company law, and we have the UK company law guru here, shareholders have no obligation to exercise their rights unless there are controlling shareholders and unless, you know.
Yeah, I think that's getting into this discussion we've been having, which I'm still
Yes.
in my head trying to sort through as well. It gets a little bit, things start to overlap a bit.
Okay,
But sorry, just very quickly to follow up on that, I suppose my question is, when the stewardship code is asking from an institutional investor to report on how they engage or how they monitor, how they vote, or when the pension funds, for instance, are going to be asked to disclose how they invest and how much they're investing in UK public equity, for instance, this is not anymore about the clients only. This also becomes about the asset, which can be a firm, you know, it can be a single company, or it can be the UK market as a whole. But that's part of what I call the asset stewardship. Again, as I said, the term may not be the right term.
good. So I'm under strict instructions, I'm afraid, to draw this discussion to an end. And if you look through the glass partitions at the end of the room, you will see that the hordes are gathering. So it remains for me to thank Dionysia for a really fantastic lecture.
Thank you.
Very thought-provoking, as the lively discussion has demonstrated. And we look forward to seeing the final product.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.